This is NNI Bites Big Learnings, a podcast where fellow healthcare professionals converse about the latest on nutrition science. We are joined by the chairs and speakers of NNI and WNSC Workshop 102 as they share practical insights on the impact of proper nutrition that contribute in the optimal growth of children.
Hello, welcome to the Nestlé Nutrition Institute podcast, NNI Bites, Big Learnings, which the series from the Nestlé Nutrition Institute Workshop 102 with the title Growing Strong, Harnessing the Power of Nutrition for Child Health. And I'm your host today. My name is Mike Posner. I'm the Medical Director for Nestlé Nutrition Institute Europe. And of course, I'm not alone. I have I'm joined by a distinguished speaker, Professor Koletzko from the Ludwig Maximilian University in Germany. And today we are going to talk about the very interesting topic of how early life nutrition can impact the future health of the child. And Professor Koletzko will share with us how we can intervene during the critical period so as to better shape child health. Welcome, Berthold Koletzko.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And let's start with one of the questions, I think, what you will also discuss during your presentation at the workshop. So what do you feel are the key strategies that could be used in early infant nutrition to reduce the risk of obesity in later life?
Yeah, thank you. What we've learned over the recent past is that indeed early childhood, infancy in early childhood has a very strong predictive value on not only later health in general, but actually also on the risk to develop later on obesity and the associated diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular risk, and so forth. And the title of the workshop, I think, says it all. Growing Strong is the key topic here, because we've learned that the growth trajectories in early childhood are a very strong predictor of later body size and also the body fat content, which is even more important for the health outcome than just the body mass. So growing strong, people in the past probably would have interpreted this as the more the better, the taller, the heavier, the better, because we have traditionally been looking mostly at undernutrition, which of course is still a big challenge around the world. In Indonesia, we have about 30% of the children being stunted. So it's not solved, although we are seeing a slow decline of the rates of stunting and particularly of wasting around the world. But what we also see today is that we have more children that are overweight and obese than thin all around the world, including in countries that are challenged by low income and difficult conditions. And it begins, as I said, early in childhood. Many studies have shown that if you have a rapid weight gain, particularly in infancy in the second year of life, this is a strong predictor of the later risk of obesity and adiposity, in other words, increased body fatness. Now, people might wonder, why is that? Obviously, there's only a limited capacity of the growing infant and toddler to deposit lean body mass. So if we overdo it, if we overfeed, the normal reaction of the body is to deposit more body fat. And body fatness then leads to a trajectory that increases the risk of later health problems.
I think it's a very interesting first message. One thing is really to follow up the growth curve and also to see if this accelerated growth curve, then we should also think about what is the reason about this. And this leads me to my question about, what to do from a nutritional standpoint of view, how we can best support. This is a very important period in our life, even with the potential to prevent obesity. So what you would say it's the best?
So the message you just worded, I couldn't agree more with, but it still needs a lot of communication, not only to the public and to families, but even to healthcare professionals. It's a change of paradigm to what we used to believe in the past. If I think of my grandmother always thought the chubby baby is a better baby. It's more protected against the risk of infection, diarrhea when you lose transiently some weight. So the concept was an extra spoon is better for the baby. If you like, the happy Buddha was the model. So it's an important message. It is related to the amount of feeding, particularly during bottle feeding, complementary feeding. Don't stuff the baby. Not every cry of a baby is a sign that it needs more food. Sometimes just cuddling and playing is the right answer. And also, if you look at the composition of feeding, don't stuff a baby with empty calories, with a lot of sugar or sugar drinks. That's not helpful. Now, what other options do we have? Obviously, breastfeeding is our model, our prime target for infant feeding. And a number of studies have associated breastfeeding with a reduced risk of later obesity and with a lesser risk of having a high weight gain until 1 year of age. So that is one thing that we always want to promote, protect, and support as much as we can. Then, of course, we ask why then is breastfeeding associated with
that
a
would
lower
be
weight gain?
one of my next questions. If we say
Yeah.
breastfeeding is, I mean, it's the best nutrition, that we are
Sure.
fully agree, but even with this prevention of obesity, but then we need to ask ourselves, what is maybe the factor in breast milk, what makes it this benefit?
And that's a very difficult question because there's so many different things between breastfeeding and non-breastfeeding. I think the observations that we have on breastfeeding show us that there is a dose-response effect. It's particularly the duration of breastfeeding that is related to the risk of obesity, longer breastfeeding having greater effects. It's not so much a question of exclusive or predominant or partial breastfeeding. So it appears not to be essential to be exclusively breastfeeding, but it's really the duration of breastfeeding. So that dose-response effect would lead one to assume it could be related to the composition of breast milk, of certain factors that are provided with breastfeeding. And then you can come up with a lot of hypotheses. Is it the macronutrients? Is it micronutrients? Is it bioactive factors? And I think the question is unanswered. In our group, we have looked at one factor, that is the amount of protein supplied, because traditionally bottle feeding had provided much more milk protein than human milk, coming from the model of cow's milk, basically, and the idea protein is very important for infants, the more the better. And we have done a large randomized controlled trial supported by the European Commission with inclusion of almost 1,700 healthy babies in Europe. And we've seen that, in fact, the protein supply in the first year of life has a very, very marked effect on the weight gain, not only during the period of early feeding, not during the first year when we did the intervention, but also after the end of this different feeding at 2 years, still there was a marked impact on the body mass, and it continued until school age. At school age, we saw if we provide an infant formula with less protein, more similar to the protein content in human milk, compared to conventional high protein infant formula feeding in the first year of life, we have a 2.6-fold difference in obesity rate at 6 years. 2.6-fold is a huge effect size. We never expected to have such a large impact of infant feeding. That's actually bigger than what most prevention strategies in childhood can achieve. And interestingly enough, the effect persists until early adolescence. We followed up the children at 11 years, and we can still see an effect. So it seems to be a lasting effect of the early protein supply. And the message that arises out of that is very clear. Obviously, we need to avoid feeding too much protein. We believe particularly milk protein is a key factor in infants. That is, if we use infant formula to substitute breastfeeding or just to top up breastfeeding, we should try to find a formula that is similar to human milk as much as possible in the protein content. And at least as important, I think, is we must avoid feeding unmodified cow's milk in the first year of life whenever that is feasible and affordable, because we know cow's milk has 3 times as much protein as human milk or modern infant formula. So feeding cow's milk really is a recipe for disaster, with overfeeding protein, enhancing weight gain, in addition to the other adverse effects like having untoward effects on iron status.
I think it's very interesting, this protein compound. And do you think it is only the amount, or is also the quality of the protein also plays a role? Following this protein hypothesis, there may be specific amino acids that play a role.
That's a really important question. When we started our study, my hypothesis was that it is the amino acids that stimulate the growth factors that are important in infancy, insulin, IGF-1, insulin like growth factor 1, which are released by higher circulating concentration of the branched chain amino acids, leucine, valine, isoleucine. And in fact, we saw that in our randomized trial. We saw that there was a marked difference in insulin IGF-1 secretion with the protein supply of the babies, and it was directly related to the IGF-1 concentration to the weight gain velocity, and in other words, to the excessive weight gain. Now, the branched chain amino acids are particularly high components in dairy proteins, in milk proteins. And when we looked at the complementary feeding period, we saw that animal protein, in particular milk protein intake, was associated with the risk of excessive weight gain, but not the intake of plant protein, which could be due to the hypothesis I just mentioned. It could also be due to the fact that in infants that we studied, milk protein is a dominant source of protein. But at least based on the data we have, we would not emphasize to reduce meat or fish protein, which is associated with a lot of good nutrition micronutrients. We would also not want to restrict the intake of vegetables or legumes, but our focus would be on milk protein.
And I know that the group is, we are discussing how long this might be the effect, and I know that your group is also studying beyond the 12 months now with a specific protein supply. Can you briefly elaborate already about something from the results?
Yeah, motivated by this very, very large effect size of limiting protein intake in infancy, we thought about the question, could it be beneficial also to limit the protein supply after infancy? That was stimulated also by observational studies in the toddler age that have associated protein intake after infancy with higher weight gain and higher risk of obesity later. There was a very nice meta-analysis performed for the Nordic nutritional recommendations that confirmed, yes, protein intake is associated with the later body mass index, and the most sensitive age period in that meta-analysis was a period from birth to age 2 years. So based on this, we thought, why don't we look at the toddler age from 1 year onwards, which is a period when a lot of children are consuming high amounts of milk and milk protein. And so we performed a large randomized clinical trial with more than 1,600 children included at the age of 1 year. And they were randomized to 2 types of milk during the second year of life, one with a protein content very similar to normal cow's milk, and the other arm has a milk which had a protein content close to that of human milk at later stages of lactation. The first endpoint is at 2 years, the growth up to 2 years, and we follow up the children further until 6 years. What we see is also in the second year of life, there's a very strong effect on the protein intake on the child growth. With the lower protein content, the children on average grew like they should grow based on the WHO centiles. So their standard deviation scores stayed pretty stable from 1 to 2 years. With the high protein content, however, there was excessive growth, there was excessive weight gain and length gain, deviating from the norms of growth. For the body mass index, the measure of obesity, the results are a bit more difficult. There was a significant increase of the body mass index at 18 months, but not at 24 months in the whole group. But we saw a difference between sides. In one side, there was an increase in the body mass index, in the other, not. We're looking at the data further to try to understand this. But we're also following up these children up to 6 years to see whether there's any long-lasting impact. But for now, I would say we have no reason to overdo protein intake in the second year of life. We don't want children to have a growth that markedly deviates from the growth of normal percentiles. And therefore, I would think it's prudent to avoid having a high intake of cow's milk. And it might be an option, if it's feasible and affordable, to replace normal cow's milk by a milk product for toddlers that has less protein and at the same time is enriched with micronutrients.
I think it's a very exciting field and a lot of research to be done. Maybe a short answer to a very maybe specific question is, there is a discussion, do we need to stay to cow's milk-based formulas? Or what do you think about alternative protein sources, maybe even for this target group? Maybe short question.
Well, at the moment, we have no choice because the regulatory standards all over the world stipulate we need to use dairy protein, with the one exception being soy protein. But I don't see any reason why it should not be possible to feed babies also with other proteins, at least as part of the milk formulations. I think there's a lot of opportunity for health outcomes and also for reducing the CO2 footprint of such formulations. But obviously it needs to be closely evaluated. The first request we always have for such modifications is to see, is it safe, is it suitable?
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think it also shows a little bit the direction. I really thank you for this great time about, I think two things. One thing is we need to train to watch the growth in the early life and not to accept this accelerated growth. Then, of course, we have a very good strategy in our hand is motivate the families to breastfeed the babies. And on the other hand, to understand the role of protein in this crucial period. And I really thank you for the time to elaborate on that. And I invite, of course, all listeners of this podcast to download the NNI app 365. Then you have access to everything. Thank you very much again, Professor Koletzko.
Thank you.
And that concludes today's episode. Thank you for joining us for this special episode from NNI and WNSC Workshop 102. We hope you enjoyed and learned from this quick discussion, fellow experts. Till the next episode.